All right, so we're just on 3 o'clock. So we might get started. I imagine people will keep joining over the next few minutes. The numbers are climbing as I speak, actually. So what I might do is I'll just begin because we've got some introductions. So just before we start, I'd like to begin by paying my respects to the traditional custodians of the unceded lands on which we work and live, and to elders past, present, and emerging, and to Aboriginal people in this meeting. Today I'm joining from Bidjigal land, and feel free to add the lands where you're joining from into the chat. So my name is Kira Smith. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Social Policy Research Centre. And today I'm delighted to introduce the seminar, Everyday Steps to Address Everyday Harm Against People with Cognitive Disability. So today's seminar reports on key findings from a 3-year study about the everyday harm experienced by young people with cognitive disability in their paid support relationships. So the project is led by Professor Sally Robinson from Flinders University. Sally leads research and academic practice in disability and community inclusion. Her research with children, young people, and adults with disability is about what helps them feel safe, well, and happy at difficult times in their lives. Most of Sally's work is done in teams that include people with disability as researchers and advisors. She also works with governments and organizations about how to listen to the things that matter to disabled people. Other lead researchers on the project include Karen Fisher, professor at the Social Policy Research Centre, UNSW Sydney, and Heike Ikehima, Associate Professor of Philosophy at UNSW Sydney. And the project also includes community researchers with disability and university-based researchers, including me. So this is a bit of an unusual presentation. I normally chair these, but I've been lucky enough to be involved with this project over the last 3 years. So I'll be presenting a few slides with Sally. So Sally and I will speak for about 40 minutes, after which we'll have time for questions and discussion. And before we begin, if I could just ask everybody to please mute themselves, as this will help with the audio. If you have any questions during the seminar, please submit them via the chat and we'll go through them in the Q&A session after the presentation, or you can wait until the Q&A and ask a question directly. And please note that Zoom has an auto captions function that you can turn on by clicking the CC button at the bottom of the screen. And please also note that this seminar is being recorded. So within a week or so, you should get a link to the recording. So that's it from me for the time being. So I'm going to hand over to Sally. Thank you, Sally.
Thank you, Kira, and hello, everybody. I'm so pleased to be here and speaking with you. It's very exciting to see some faces and names of people who we know have been following along with interest as we've been doing this work. And of course, people who are new to us in this project. We're really heartened by how interested people are in learning what we've been finding out. You can see that we have a big team who've been part of this work. So there's been a lot of us travelling along together, finding out very interesting things in this project. So what we'd like to do is to spend the time today talking to you about what everyday harm is, introducing the project, sharing some key findings from the research, and really trying to emphasise what is relevant from what we've been finding out for practice and policy change. So trying to be as practical as possible out of a theoretically informed project. So I said that we had a big and diverse team, and we're working in a difficult area. It's a hard subject, talking about everyday harm and the things that really trouble people in their everyday lives. As you can see, we've put a lot of effort into making sure that our team is okay as we go through. And this is most of our Everyday Harms team after one of our workshops. You can see probably one of the things that's quite evident is that we're a team dominated by women, but we're also incredibly well informed by 4 community researchers who bring their experience of intellectual disability and their expertise into our team, and we're incredibly enriched by that. The importance of using the findings from our research in our team, as well as in an outward-facing way, has been really evident for us. Our project is informed by recognition theory, which is about how all of us feel cared about, respected, and valued in the relationships that we have with each other. And this project in particular is about addressing misrecognition, about using everyday steps to prevent and respond to the kind of harm that we all experience in our relationships together, and also about using trauma responsive practice. So internally, as well as in the outward facing work that we've done together, that's been really important. As I said, there's been co-production all the way through the project with our community researchers in particular, through co-design workshops that have informed every stage of the project, and through our partner organisations. This has been a really unusual ARC linkage project in that we've had a number of partner organisations, and they've brought huge value into the project through having 2 government agencies, service providers, and systems and advocacy organisations who are all part of the project. And that's helped us really keep our eye on what the project means for policy and practice as we go along. So just turning now then to what everyday harm is. It sounds like a really everyday term, a very common term, but we've been really surprised to find that it hasn't been used in a scholarly way or a practice way before we started doing this project. So everyday harm happens in everyday interactions between people with disability and support workers, or by how things are done in support organisations in our project. The kinds of actions and inactions that happen can be intentional or unintentional. And these sorts of actions and inactions that cause everyday harm often aren't noticed because they're so common. Or they're not considered serious enough to be reported. And so that means that people might overlook them or brush them off. Everyday harm can happen when people's rights are ignored, or when feelings aren't cared about or valued or respected. And when everyday harm happens frequently, these negative impacts build up and they can badly affect people's well-being. People experience everyday harm at the time of the action or the inaction, or a long time after. And you can see on the slide that everyday harm in the typology that we developed in this project affects people's feelings, their mental health, their physical health, their growth and learning, their relationships, and their reputation. These are the kinds of things that we all experience in our lives, times when you feel humiliated, overlooked, silenced, marginalised. They're things that are not disability specific, but they affect people with disability more often than they do people who don't have disability. Why it matters is because it has damaging impacts on people's lives, and people often don't have ways to express what's happened to them. Compared to other kinds of harms like violence, abuse, neglect, and exploitation, it's less likely to be addressed in policy. And policies really need to name this kind of harm so people know what to do when they're concerned. And so we really need to get into a position where people and support workers and organisations know what everyday harm is, so that they notice it and support people when they experience it, and they're able to change practices to prevent it. So this was the starting point for our project, what we did about this. And why we were really keen to use the term everyday harm was to find an accessible language for daily use. The concept of everyday harm, we think, offers a contribution through reframing microaggression theory for groups of people like people with intellectual disability who are likely to find that broader theory inaccessible. And so we're really looking for an accessible language for daily use. And so it's really informed by recognition theory and microaggression theory, and focusing on interpersonal harm and how that affects the quality of people's relationships. And we hope that this concept and the language around it could create opportunities for exploring possibilities for restoration and for preventing further harm in people's relationships. So in our project, we're really looking for not so much dwelling in the experience of it, but what to do about it, because it's such a universal experience for everybody. So What was our project in this context? We really wanted to identify what this experience was for young people with cognitive disability and the paid support relationships that they had with disability support workers. And from there to develop a practice framework that prevents harm in these relationships and promotes wellbeing. We worked with 36 pairs of young people and the support workers that they chose and interviewed them across 6 different sites, doing 2 interviews per pair and using creative methods for accessibility with the young people. We also separately interviewed 30 managers about what happens at an organisational level to support that practice that happens between the pairs. We used a collaborative qualitative data analysis method called a fishbowl method and did thematic analysis around that. That's a whole another separate paper. And the key finding really that has come out of this, if I was going to wrap it up in one sentence, was we can all prevent and address everyday harm. There are jobs for all of us that will make a difference in this space. People know that when they experience or they see everyday harm, people know this feeling. They know it in their head, their heart, or their gut. Our community researchers use this concept of head, heart, and gut. It had a lot of resonance for them, and it really sat deeply with the rest of us. But even though people know it, it can be really hard to stop it from happening. Another thing that came from our community research team was the saying, it doesn't have to be this way. So even though it's something that's really common, it really sits with people, and it's something that happens very frequently in people's lives, it doesn't mean that we have to just continue on being this way. There are a lot of things that came out of this research that we can do to prevent and address everyday harm. And a lot of them are folded into people's daily practice. This is not the kind of thing where we need to wait for funding, we need to wait for resources, we need to wait for some sort of, huge tidal wave of change to do something about. There are things we can do in the everyday to address this everyday harm and improve people's lives. So the practice framework that has come out of the research is about everyday steps in practice. And we've called them everyday steps, but it's really sort of more of a dance rather than steps. And the dancers in this dance are the person, the worker, and the organisation or the manager. What's happening that sort of sets the music for this dance are the rules and the culture and practicing the steps that are going on around everybody who's part of the dance. People, as I go on and talk through the next slides, you'll recognise a lot of this from your own experience. If you're somebody who uses services yourself, or you work in services, or you're someone who writes policy, you'll see a lot of these things and you'll recognise them. The findings of the research really show that there are things that we can all do, and it draws together a lot of these steps in ways that show how we can use it in this context. So in the next few slides, I'll show how it looks in more detail and draw on some of the examples from our fieldwork. So the first one, the first step is about being known and to know others by building trust to prevent everyday harm. And in the next few slides, I'm using the same approach, which has a yellow circle on the left for the person, a green circle in the middle for the worker, and a blue circle on the right hand for the organisation. And there are details in each of those circles about the kinds of things, the kinds of practices that people can do, or workers can do, or organisations can do in each of those steps. So in this first one, young people and support workers invested in their working relationships to build rapport and to build mutual trust. In a lot of the interviews, we saw the positive bonds that people developed between themselves and their workers. And there was a lot of warmth and a lot of playful joking around that was often evident between people. And some of the things that young people and support workers did that built capacity to recognise what everyday harm looks and feels like were through things like taking time to develop trust and rapport, to sense when something wasn't right, learning about each other's communication preferences to understand how people might communicate when they've been harmed, noting that that people's previous experiences of harm might contribute to everyday harm that they experience, and learning about everyday harm in formal and informal settings. But some people, it wasn't straightforward, of course. Some people said that they needed to be attuned to support workers' moods to avoid the risk of experiencing everyday harm in their interactions. And sometimes young people used significant emotional labour to navigate the willingness or otherwise of staff to undertake tasks or to discuss certain issues. So as I go through and use people's names here, they're all pseudonyms from our research. Ellis, a young person in our research, said that I've learnt from each carer to pick up their mood when they're not comfortable talking about something, because I can just tell in their face when they might not be able to talk about something on that day. And I ask, are you comfortable doing it today? And if they say no or feel a bit unsure, I just let them do what they want. So people, were really negotiating and navigating around the emotional temperature that staff had, that they were bringing into their willingness to talk about things. The second step that people used was to make opportunities to express themselves to prevent everyday harm. Young people and support workers acknowledged the potential for harm by checking in with one another. They asked if harm had happened. They named and described harm. They communicated about harm that they experienced. And that was really important, because to reduce harm, people, of course, needed to feel safe talking about actual or potential harm with support workers. And they needed that safe relational space in order to do that. And so to be able to have direct communication needed a safe space in order to have those conversations. And that was a really circular relationship. Sometimes both young people and support workers found it hard to find safe spaces and ways to have those communications. And that happened in direct ways and indirect ways. So Lewis, for example, had the reputation of being easygoing in his service, and he often found that he was expected to be flexible when it came to choosing activities. And because he had that reputation, it was hard for him to pursue his preferences, because his reputation was that Lewis won't mind taking the short straw on something. And so speaking up was hard for him, and it was rarely an option. Support workers also found it difficult to communicate about everyday harm. Sometimes they noticed it, but they found it. They were unsure about how to acknowledge it. A worker in one of our interviews talked about some harmful practices that she thought needed changing, and was critical of other workers who didn't centre young people's best interests. But she said, it's hard though. If you notice someone speaking a bit wrong, how you navigate that, it can be difficult, because you have to put yourself out there to talk about those things. So that brings us to the next one, which is about listening to each other about everyday harm. And here, there's a real centering of active listening by support workers. And people talked about how intuitive active listening was in their practice, and how they built on their knowledge and their understanding of the young person to do that. A lot of support workers felt that they understood young people's tacitly expressed needs and their moods and their body language. Layla, a young person, spoke highly of her current support workers because they were responsive and they listened to her needs, and they made what she called reasonable adjustments to prevent her from experiencing harm. Things like being open when she requested to reschedule meetings, or conduct them over the phone if she was feeling exhausted. And she contrasted that responsiveness to her previous support workers, who viewed requests negatively and wrote in her case notes that she didn't show up, or she constantly reschedules, and were really negative about that. The fourth interpersonal area was how people understood and noticed everyday harm. And this is a really important step, because it encourages people to be curious and look for things that might be less easy to notice. And while we saw some really good practice here, where people took opportunities to learn and to share what everyday harm is, and to practice naming and discussing and normalizing the fact that everyday harm happens a lot. We also saw a lot of silences and withdrawal from young people. And these are really important learning opportunities for workers and organisations to find ways into to understanding and noticing everyday harm with young people. Our analysis showed that when options were constrained for young people to understand what everyday harm was and to notice it together, they used strategies of avoiding and complying to prevent harm from happening, and that had some troubling implications for their safety. Several young people and support workers talked to us about how the young person removed themselves from situations where they felt harm was possible. And for some people, that was a trauma response, and for other people, it was a considered strategy. So Justin, for example, felt unable to stay in a room where emotion was running high because it triggered distress and anxiety due to previous traumatic experiences that he's had. Other support workers talked about how young people would walk away when they were agitated or upset by a conversation, and how a strategy that they used was about providing options for the person to return to the conversation with dignity, or having shared spaces that people could re-engage when they felt ready. And so that having respectful ways for people to come back were important ways of them noticing and responding to everyday harm. There were also lots of instances where people chose not to speak about things that they would like to change or things that they'd like to improve in their support relationship. And nonverbal communication showed us that even gentle approaches to asking young people about their thoughts might have made them uncomfortable. So it was a really sensitive space and needed a lot of delicacy. In this space, the importance of a work culture that allowed for self-reflection, where people could learn from mistakes, such as unintentional everyday harm, and be supported to make things better together, was a really important area as well. So one support worker, Dave, critically assessed how his response to Zach, a young person early in their work relationship, might have been a potential cause of harm, and it led to changes in how he responded to Zach. He was talking about how how Zach would hop in the car and he would be repeating the same question, and Dave would get frustrated with him and say, "I've already explained this to you." And then he clued in that Zach was actually really anxious, and that was why he was asking the question again and again. And then he changed his response and started to work differently with Zach and to say, "Are you all right? What are you thinking about? How are you feeling?" And that really helped, because Zach started to talk about the feelings that were driving his questions rather than the questions. And so Dave talked about how his own self-reflection really helped him change the way that he saw what was going on in that interaction. And then the fifth step is about repairing when everyday harm happens. Given the inevitability of everyday harm in interacting as human people together, repair really involves reflecting on what's happened and problem solving together. Once pairs noticed that harm had happened and they acknowledged it together, a lot of people tried to respond promptly. And this, really involved reflecting on where the harm had come from, how they'd acted, how other people had acted, what had happened in the organisation, how the institution had responded, and the context in which the harm had happened. And then problem solving about the next steps and whether other people needed to be involved, whether there were additional support was needed with problem solving. And asking questions like, how can we work better together? Thinking about what's working well, what's not working. After that's the sort of response, people often needed to do the repair as well. And sometimes repair happened between the people, and at other times it required the organisation to help when interpersonal situations were damaged by the harm. And in the best examples, repair validated the experiences of everybody involved, and it was constructive, and everybody was informed about potential situations. But in our data, repair was often an incomplete process. Quinn gave an example that about how their their actions led to miscommunication and how they looked to repair the relationship. She talked about how they were working with somebody and they got very frustrated with the fact that they couldn't understand what Quinn was saying, and they lashed out. And their initial reaction was like, wow, okay. It wasn't their fault. It was that breakdown of communication, and that person was rightfully frustrated, and they got the reaction that they weren't expecting. They both took some time, and she said, first of all, I'm really sorry I made you feel that way. And then they both took a step back and then came forward again and found a way to work together on a better way of communicating once they moved past the point of frustration. It's fair to say, though, that some people accepted harm because they felt they had little alternative. They adjusted their expectations about how people might speak to them or treat them, and they felt resigned to being hurt by the inactions of other people and the organisations that were meant to support them. And maybe that was due to not feeling supported to communicate about harm, or not having pathways to have assistance in repairing it. And they said things like they don't raise issues, they just do what support workers say they should do. But young people also used a whole bunch of strategies for self-repair to make themselves feel better and to deal with difficult emotions. People had some great strategies around positive self-talk and journaling and taking time out of difficult situations and going walking and exercising. So people used all these great strategies to help themselves feel better. But that doesn't resolve the fact that it doesn't repair relationships, and it doesn't address ongoing problems which are caused by what's happening on the other side of the relationship. I've been talking for quite a while. It's time for me to pass over to Kira to talk to you about the next part of the everyday harm.
Thank you, Sally. So the research, the interviews with young people and with the managers and board managers showed that there are 5 key ways that services and systems can improve the ways we understand, prevent, and address everyday harm. So these are capacity building, being attentive to staff employment, safeguarding policies and managing risk, management overview of incidents of everyday harm, and governance that includes people with disability in decision-making. So together, these help us to develop a shared understanding about everyday harm, share responsibility to prevent and address everyday harm, make sure everyday harm is countercultural so that when it happens, people notice it and call it out. So organizations are already doing some good things, but we need to do more. And more improvements happen when more people do things together. Next slide, please, Sally. So organizations that addressed and prevented harm did so when they arranged young people's support in ways that promoted their agency, built trust and reliability, and fostered collaborative approaches to problem solving. So this capacity building happened when organizations offered space, time, and training for staff and young people to talk about good practices for changing everyday harm, reflect on ways to improve support, practice how to check in and listen to each other without judgment, build in supervision and communication loops between the person, worker, leader, manager, and board, and use these communication loops to fix and share everyday harm problems at the personal and organizational levels. So these elements allowed time to address potential problems and elicited young people's solutions to problems and other aspects of support. In contrast, organizing support in ways which limited choices or restricted time for relationship building increased everyday harm between pairs. Work cultures in which certain topics were taboo also limited opportunities for learning and growth. Next slide, please. With respect to staff employment, organizations can recruit support workers and managers who understand everyday harm, set clear work expectations that prevent and address everyday harm in organizational culture and individual support, and make time to regularly review the match between the person and worker to find and fix everyday harm problems or replace the support relationship. Next slide, please. The ways that policies were applied prevented and addressed harm. It was important to have rules that encourage and manage responses when people, workers, and families speak up about everyday harm. Build a culture that encourages people, families, staff, and managers to speak up when they notice everyday harm. Make time and places to practice speaking up. celebrate organizational culture, and support relationships that find and fix everyday harm. So a careful balance of rules was needed to guide but not constrain staff and young people. The ways rules were applied affected the culture of organizations both positively and negatively, and the opposite was also true with culture affecting rules. Next slide, please. So management oversight was important for preventing and addressing everyday harm. Actions included tracking everyday harm to understand how to prevent and address it and improve the quality of support, asking people, staff, families, and visitors about everyday harm they noticed to self or others, asking people and staff about how to change everyday harm where they work, and making ways to tell people how their ideas about change to everyday harm were acted on. Next slide, please, Sally. So within each of those 5 aspects of organizational context to prevent and address everyday harm, formal rules and informal culture interacted. So this picture on the slide is a heading from our community researchers' work. They have influenced our easy English in calling institutional norms, the formal rules and informal culture, the rules and vibes of organizations. Next slide, please. So rules and culture interact in organizations. Culture shapes rules. Listening, respecting rights, and valuing agency foster harm-preventing practices. Distance matters. When managers are disconnected, culture struggles to influence rules. And the effects are cyclical. Rights-focused rules reinforce supportive culture and vice versa. Inconsistent or weak rules breed disregard, reducing demand for resourcing and perpetuating harms. So back to you now, Sally.
Thanks, Kira. So in closing, rules that prioritise the rights of people with disability and positive culture enabled young people and support workers in our project to effectively prevent and address everyday harm. And further, I guess, our findings indicated that rules and culture can interact in a way that amplifies harm, but they also compound in beneficial ways. And this potentially means that making small positive adjustments to rules and culture will have greater flow-on effects. So our project explores how everyday harm experienced by young people in disability support relationships can be prevented and addressed. And it highlights the cumulative impact of everyday harm in young people's lives and how that led them to adopt strategies to prevent further harm. And really, the findings provide a lot of evidence of young people's strength and their adaptability and their resilience, and also the significant emotional labour that they undertake to prevent harm to themselves or harm to other people. And the findings have got clear policy and practice implications for preventing and addressing everyday harm to young people with cognitive disability by thinking about the cost to young people and the opportunities for organisations and in policy and in practice to step in and acknowledge, address and prevent everyday harm. There are some good policy examples through things like the NDIS Code of Conduct guidance, which gives some detailed illustrations of interpersonal actions and inactions that cause everyday harm. And in addition to acknowledging the importance of interpersonal interactions, these sorts of policies could include more scenarios that demonstrate how culture and rules are crucial in preventing and addressing everyday harm. So as we bring this presentation to a close, we just wanted to talk about where we're up to with the project. We have a lot of knowledge translation work happening at the moment. We're working with collaborating organisations to develop a whole lot of accessible material. So accessible videos, easy read summaries, learning materials for organisations that come from this material, that from all of the research. So you can see this is hot off the press. We got the website address today. There's nothing there yet, but early next year we'll have a website to house all of that material. So please do bookmark it now so that you can revisit next year and you can see all those great resources that are being developed for us. There are 8 academic papers that come from this project. Most of them are under review still at the moment, but they will be coming up progressively over the next 3 or 4 months. And there'll be summaries of all of the academic papers on the website. We know how much people love reading full academic papers, but access to all of that information will be available through the website too. We'll keep doing conference presentations and seminars about the project to share the key learning. The most exciting conference presentations are the ones given by our community researchers. They're doing a paper at the Australasian Disability Society for Intellectual Disability in a couple of weeks, which is a really creative way to look at what everyday harm is and how it's approached. They do a role play called The Big Cafe, which is considerably more lively than listening to Kira and I talk about everyday harm. And then we're framing the next project, how we stand on the shoulders of what we've learned in a disability services context about everyday harm, to look at what happens in the public sphere and how we can change attitudes that cause everyday harm for people with disability. So we're really interested to see where we can take this as we sort of socialise the concept of everyday harm and think about where we can go next with it. So I will finish the presentation there. It might be nice to just invite Karen Fisher, if you want to add anything, Karen. I know that you're here, and Karen's been a really key part of the project and always has something reflective to say about the content. So just an invitation to you, Karen, if there's anything that you'd like to add at the end of the presentation before we go to Q&A.
Thanks, Sally. There's some really interesting discussion going on in the chat, so maybe that's a good place to start that, as to where everyday harm fits with other forms of violence, abuse and neglect, and also on the other side of where it fits with good practice. So I think what's so helpful for us in this type of seminar is actually to hear from the participants who are here today to bring those ideas together. So let's move on to the discussion.
Thanks, Karen and Sally. So what we usually do at this stage in the seminars is I have a look at the chat and just have a look at the questions. So what I will do is I'll go through those gradually. And if people are here and they want to ask their question directly, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question directly. But I'll start going through them anyway as we have them. So the first one is from Leslie. And that was a question regarding number 4, which on the slide was understanding and notice everyday harm. And the question was regarding organizations, where does this interplay with those clients in that family is withholding information, so therefore organizations struggle to provide the appropriate supports when lack of understanding of diagnosis.
So I want to, I suppose, preface all of our responses, and my responses anyway, by saying that every project has its limitations, and ours is no exception. There are lots of things that we didn't explore. And so we didn't go a long way into what happened with people's family relationships. We were really concentrating on what was happening in the relationship between the person and the support worker, and thinking about what the organizational context was that influenced that support relationship. Obviously, people live in a lot of different family contexts, and they've got different levels of positivity and support, and all of those things play into the kinds of or influence the kinds of relationships that they have with support workers and the way in which organisations support that, provide support in those contexts. I don't think we have anything very specific to say about the relationships between families and organisations, though, Leslie. Karen, unless you have something to add.
Just to say that one of the interesting ways that young people particularly sought to address or repair their everyday harm experience was to seek advice and help from other people. And sometimes that was families, sometimes it was their peers. Sometimes they even resorted to support from a paid professional, like a doctor or a counsellor. And I think what's important for us when learning from those clever strategies that they're doing is that this everyday harm might have occurred within a particular relationship, but it's in a social context. And families, for those who have family members active in their lives, those families are part of that context, either in terms of helping prevent everyday harm, or sometimes sadly contributing to the causes of everyday harm. But the young people were also quite wise about how to bring in families as resources in addressing and repairing.
Thanks, Karen. So there's a few questions that I think Karen's already addressed in the chat. Thank you, Karen. Great webinar, thank you. Leave another meeting. Really excited for the resources. I would love to implement them in my client representative committee's learning section next year. So to anyone who's waiting on resources, they will be coming. So that's one of the fabulous things about this project, actually, that although very much theory driven, but it will result in a lot of practical resources that are being co-designed with people with disabilities, so that they'll actually be practical and useful for the people that this project is hoping to benefit. And
sorry,
then
Kira, I wonder if we could just ask Tiffany if she would like to speak to that one, because so Tiffany has suggested that she'd like to use them, and because of course we're designing those resources now, so if you've got any comments on what resources are good, how particularly resources that you're using at the moment, we've learnt especially that people don't have a lot of time for training or resource use, and so we're trying to collect examples or hear tips from people like Tiffany about what works. Obviously a 2-day training session is never going to work. What is it? Is it a 2-minute resource, or what's in between? So certainly invite Tiffany or others to put your hand up and speak.
we've got a hand up from Lisa.
Hi, I would love to talk about this in staff meetings. So I'm a practice person, I'm a social worker who sits behind our frontline workers, and so my role is to try and attend to all those sorts of the relationship between the workers and the participants. And so we have enough time to have a monthly meeting. And so some of our people are people that work in the community, and some of them are that support people in their homes, like they live in, group living, or share houses where they share flats and things. And it would be great to have little videos and examples, so it's not, something that's kind of 20 minutes long, and maybe a few that you could do over a series of meetings where you could just show people doing doing the everyday harm and what that means. And then maybe some of the young researchers, if they were willing to, but to talk about what that meant for them and how that felt, and how it might have, the idea that it silenced them, they stopped seeking, just so that our workers can really understand the impact of unkind words, or everyone's in a hurry today, just hurry up and eat your dinner. I don't care that, all those things that can happen in that day-to-day So that would be good resources. So we don't have stacks of time. We might have an hour meeting, an hour and a half meeting, but just little snippets that talk about showing examples and the impact, and just that would be wonderful.
Mm.
Thanks
Thank you.
so
That's
much.
really helpful.
Yeah.
All right. I'll just keep going through the questions. There's one about some more comments. Actually, I think we've kind of got through most of the questions in the chat. There was a question about age range of research participants. So 18 to 31 was the age range of the young people interviewed. Yeah, and do we have any other comments from people, or any questions anyone would like to ask a direct question?
I'll just respond to the one from Rachel about the Disability Royal Commission. So the question is from Rachel. Do you want to hop on and say anything about it, or will I read it out?
No, happy for you to read it, Sal. Thanks.
There you are. Thanks, Rach.
I skipped over that one.
So the question is whether we feel the Disability Royal Commission missed or didn't clearly name everyday harm in the process of collecting stories, experiences and data, as well as in the report and the recommendations. If so, how can we ensure it's not missed in the implementation of the recommendations? This was something that drove us in putting together the application for the project in the first place, that it's the everydayness of this kind of experience that leads people to think that it's not as important as it is. And so it really does go under the radar. It goes under the policy radar. It goes under the threshold of what matters, and it becomes part of the fabric of people's lives. So it just becomes part of what's ordinary. And so people stop seeing it for how damaging it is. And it's like a fish out of water analogy, really. It's when you take the fish out of the water, or that you see how damaging it is. And so we talk about in our papers about trying to make this kind of harm countercultural. So one of the things we saw in the research was we were doing an interview and somebody came and sat across the room. They weren't part of our research, but they started doing their shift notes, and they were sitting next to another person who also wasn't in the research. But to us, that was a really strikingly strange thing to do, that you would write about somebody in front of them. And the person didn't have anything to do. They were just sitting there with nothing to do apart from wait for the staff member who was writing about them. And they didn't have access to what was being written about them. And they were a bit agitated about that. They were just a bit agitated generally. I'm assuming that they were a bit agitated about that. But if that was a countercultural experience, another staff member in that organisation would have said, why are you doing that? It wouldn't have been part of an ordinary thing in that service. So the idea of making everyday harm countercultural seems really, really important, that we change the temperature of the water in services so that when an everyday harm happens, it really stands out. It's something that people are going to comment on because it's not part of ordinary here. And the Disability Royal Commission didn't really point to that kind of harm so much. It pointed to incident-based harm more than the kind of harm that becomes part of the fabric of people's lives. And so we were really interested in spending time with people who are experts about it, who are the people who experience it all the time, to really focus with them on what do you want to change? What do you want to be different here? So that we could start to tease out the kind of practices that people do when they want things to be different, and to build a framework about those practices.
Thanks, Sally. And so there's a question.
I think Karen might have just wanted to add a little there, Kira.
Go, Karen.
No, I was just going to say there's been a few comments in the chat and implications from what Sally and Kira are saying about who is this about. As Sally said, the research was focused because research does have to be, and it was young people with cognitive disability. But what we've found already when the community researchers with intellectual disability have been presenting this in exciting ways is it resonates with everyone. So the first time they did the Big Cafe, it was a group of art and design people, groupies basically, a group of 50 people, nothing to do with disability, but because it was young people with disability presenting and using creative methods to talk about everyday harm, and particularly what we do about everyday harm, the steps that we're talking about, it resonated immediately. It's the example of when you get on the bus and somebody pushes you out of the way. Those sort of everyday experiences that we all have, that where people are rude unnecessarily, where they don't see us as people. And so while our research is particularly about young people with cognitive disability, it applies across disability, it applies across society. And what I think is strong about the young people with disability helping with our project, and then in turn with the resources and the training if this is done in services, is that it cuts through. It's not a professor talking about it, it's a young person who's talking about it, and they're talking from first person about how they fix it or how they prevent it.
Thanks, Karen. There's 2 hands up and there's a lot of questions in the chat. I'm just going to quickly read Kelly's question. So did the research differentiate between everyday harm relating to disability versus other forms of discrimination, or was it any form of everyday harm? Also love the term everyday harm, way easier to understand than microaggressions. So Sally, do you want to take that, or?
Well, to say thank you.
But so did the research differ relating to disability? No, so it was focused on people with disability, this particular project, but as Karen mentioned, I mean, this can be extended well beyond people with disability to every person. And then Erin or Jocelyn, I don't know who had their hand up first, possibly Jocelyn, if you'd like to ask your question.
Sorry, I think
no.
Erin had her hand up first and it took me a second to find the unmute button. But I mean, I actually ended up just putting a comment in the chat that I think it would be really helpful to present that information about the research applying more broadly up front in your presentations, because, and I don't know if I missed that, sorry if I did, because I felt like it was a qualifier throughout the talk, and I guess other people might feel that way. And it's really helpful to know how applicable this research is beyond the specific research group.
Thanks, Jocelyn. That's
Thank
really
you.
helpful.
It was a really great presentation, though. Thanks so much.
No, thank you.
Erin,
Thanks.
sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I did originally have a similar comment as well, but I'll move across because I think Karen partially answered. What are the next steps for turning these findings on everyday harm into actionable guidance or incentives for the support workers in real world settings? The reason I ask is the paid workforce isn't incentivized to do better because the KPIs focus on task completion, what's billable, the billable hours, I suppose, not well-being or respect. The supervisors aren't, there, and they rely on self-reporting, and quality audits rarely reach that level of everyday action. And I think that there seems to be a huge gap in training, like people are just putting the treadmill out to meet demand rather than, being able to actually monitor what the everyday action is. What will be done with this research to address that?
Erin, that's such a great question. Thank you. And the other questions have been too. One of the reasons that we're so pleased to have so many partners in this research is that they are pushing us as a research team, but this project will come to an end. And it's really important that as this project finishes and we pass over the relay stick to the next group of people about this project, that we do lots of these presentations and that our partners take the information out as well. So one of the partners in the project is the Quality and Safeguards Commission. And so the way that they take this learning into their work is really important. So the example that I gave earlier about the NDIS Code of Conduct guidance for workers and for providers as policy examples is one where learning about everyday harm can be embedded in what's required for providers and for workers. And the Commission is really interested in how they take the learning from this project into practice guidance and policy guidance that can be put out nationally for workers. The work that we're doing with the collaborators, we've been very lucky to find 2 organisations that have skills in doing accessible resource development who also do service provision. So we're hopefully going to end up with a really great pack of resources which meet the needs of people with disability, but also for workers and for managers and boards, so that there's really practice-focused resources. So we're super keen to get this pushed out as far as possible so that anybody who can use a carrot has a carrot. But then there's what you're raising is such a good question, because it's about carrots and sticks, and we need both. And you know, we can only do the carrot part of it, and then work with our partners, the partners who've got some sticks, and our partners who've got carrots. So we'll push it out as far as we can, but we're really, you know, trying to get everybody to take it up.
Being a bit literal, I was wondering where you were going with carrots there, Sally. But I think the sticks are we're obviously developing resources and advice around policy and practice frameworks, and that's why Kira was presenting on that part. Kira's leading that with our collaborators on the resources, but also our collaborators with the government. So the advice that you're giving us in the chat there on those sort of resources is very helpful. Our resource collaborators will be very pleased to see the enthusiasm on conversation cards, for example. But it's also helpful to get this specific feedback on which sticks we need as well to change practice. Because we found that culture was as important as rules, I think to take up Sally's salad suggestion there, the carrots are actually where you get cultural change. And so I think trying to make this accessible, fun, something that actually improves your work quality and your relationship quality is as important in the end as the rules.
Thanks, Karen. So we've got 3 minutes. There are a stack of questions which we won't have time to get through, but we will definitely keep note of all the comments in the chat. And if there's anything in particular anybody wants or thinks resource development should focus on, please do add it to the chat, or key gaps that you think this project might be able to fill, or that you would be interested in hearing more about. There was a question about whether there was any exploration on workers' unconscious bias that contribute towards everyday harm. Unfortunately, as Sally already mentioned, there are limitations to what we can cover in projects, but that would be very interesting. And then a comment about framing how we make everyday harm countercultural, how important that is, if we can.
I'll just pick up the point on unconscious bias.
Yeah.
That is picked up within microaggression theory, so it is wrapped up in there. Yeah.
Thank you. And then examples would make great conversation starters, so that's another good suggestion for the resource development. learning and development material for, yes, more suggestions about training materials. And the Disability Royal Commission, apologies, I'd missed that earlier, I think I was, but that's been covered. And there's 18 more new questions. I actually don't think we can get through all of these, and there's probably not much benefit of me trying to rush through them right now. But if anyone has a burning question that they want to put their hand up in the next like 20 words or less question, please feel free to maybe put your hand up now and capture the last few minutes with Sally. Karen?
Perhaps I can just say, Kira, thank you very much for hosting. I've just moved to the final slide there, which has the information about both of our universities' websites, which has information about the project on it. And the SPRC website has a video from our community researchers on it, which I'd really direct you to. It's absolutely fabulous. And then Karen's and my email addresses are there. So if you have more questions or advice for us, please do get in contact with us. We're really keen to know how we can frame the project to be as useful as possible as we're at the final stages of it.
All right, well, on that note, I think we might wrap up. So thank you everybody for joining us today. It's been really interesting to present and to kind of wear two hats in this seminar hosting session today. But thank you, Sally, and Karen and me for this very fascinating presentation. But I have to say, personally, on a personal level, it's been a really interesting project to be part of. I've really enjoyed it, and it's been so wonderful having the community researchers on board. And it's so clear the value that they bring to this project and how integral their insights are, especially into the development of the resources, because you know we're not the experts on what's valuable and what's useful. So it's been a really, really great project to be involved with. So thank you everybody for joining today. Please join us for our next seminar later in November. Actually, keep an eye on SPRC mailing lists. Thank you.
Thanks for
Bye
jumping,
everyone.
Kira.
Thank you. Bye bye.